Okay, so this is going to use masks for a particular purpose, rotoscoping, and I'm going to show some very basic examples of rotoscoping now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my clean plate as the basis of a composition. Now, there's a little bit of footage there to start I want to get rid of. I want to just see the door and nothing else, so I'm going to push the clip back along the timeline so that the figure is gone by the time the clip starts. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my yellow door left to right clip by just dragging it down onto the layers. Now what I have is I have my figure walking across an identical clip to the background. So one of the reasons that you might find yourself using a clean plate is if you want to do some sort of an effect. Now the simplest effect being that you want to make something disappear. So you can keyframe the opacity of something over a clean plate and it will appear to disappear, as they say. And that's a very simple reason that we'll be using it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it as a kind of a background, and I'm going to play around with my foreground clips. I'm going to mask them, and I'm going to create a kind of a special effect where there's going to be 3 of this guy moving across the screen. Now the way I'm going to do it is through simple rotoscoping. So first thing I need to do is I need to create some sort of a mask that contains the figure, and I'll use my ellipse tool for that. So I select the layer I want to apply the mask to, and I'll draw a rough mask down over the figure. If you hold down Shift, it allows you to move the mask. It's like kind of a bit like Photoshop that way when you're doing a selection. Now this doesn't have any visual effect, but if I switch off my background, you'll see that it is in fact masking the child. Now, because of the possibility that there's going to be a variation between my foreground and my background clip, and I'll show you what I mean, the lighting might have changed slightly, so you can see a slight halo kind of around the figure there, a darkness inside the mask as opposed to a slightly lighter outside of the mask. There is even a slight mismatch in the camera angle there. You mightn't be able to see it from where you are, but the door doesn't perfectly match up. Now a way around this is you can do a slight color correction on it, or a handy way of kind of blending the foreground into the background is to just adjust the feather of the mask, and then it's harder to notice the difference between the foreground and background. Okay, so it's softened it, so it's a little bit harder to pick up. Right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotoscope this clip so that the mask follows the action. Yeah. Okay. Right, so this is the point where the child enters the screen, so I'm going to get my mask path and I'm going to put a keyframe down. Now, the way rotoscoping works best is not to follow the action frame by frame, but to go to the start of an overall movement and then go to the end of an overall movement, being him walking off the screen, and adjusting the mask's position so that it follows. Then when you bring the playhead back, you'll see if the action matches up. It does largely here. There's a few bits there where the mask kind of clips the back heel. So what you do is you divide the space between your 2 keyframes in half, and then you see if it doesn't match up there, how can you match it up? So I'll pull that back a little bit, and now that might actually solve some of the issues I have in the intervening frames, which it does. So now this is rotoscoping in its most simple form. The mask is following the child across the screen. Now another thing I might want to do is I might want to make this clip only start when the child comes in. So I'll go to the point, the exact frame where the child steps in on the left, and I'll trim the clip back there. So the mask isn't in the way, it just all happens at the right moment in time. Now the reason for that will become obvious in a moment. Now what I have is I have an isolated figure in a mask walking across the screen. Now I can do lots of things with this effect now, and the simplest thing that I can do is I can duplicate this layer, and stagger the point on the timeline in which the second or duplicate of the child comes into the shot. This being the effect. So he walks off, the other one comes in. Now that's too far away. I want to see them both on screen at the same time. So I'll pull that just where the masks are almost touching. Now when I switch back on my clean plate, I have a composite of my clean plate, my two foreground figures walking across the screen. Very simple to do. I can duplicate that again, create a third, so it's quite simple. The idea here is that I've isolated my foreground figure into a mask and I've composited it onto a clean plate or an empty piece of video, and then I've reused that masked figure, staggered where it appears on the timeline, to create the special effect of seeing the tree. Okay? Pretty easy. Now, the next example that I'm going to show is how you would composite a piece of text into this scene. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the two top layers here. I'm going to keep... I can actually get rid of my clean plate for this, and I'll get rid of my mask as well. This is a different kind of an effect I'm going for. Now, what I have now is I've got the child walking across the screen. So let's say that I want to get a piece of text onto that door, and I want the child to run or walk on front of the piece of text. Now, this is where you're mixing synthetic objects, piece of text, with a real object being the child. Now, the objective here is to get the text in between the child and the door. Now, this is where we're going to use a mask, but we're going to look at this in a kind of an inside-out kind of a way. If I want this child to walk in front of this text, then I'm going to use the movement of the child's figure or torso as it moves across the screen, but I'm going to apply the mask to the text. Now you'll see why in a moment, and the reason basically is that I'm going to subtract the mask from the text. The text is on top of the child now, but if I put a subtract mask here, then it's going to appear as if the text goes behind. So I can do it in a static sense first, just by selecting my text, getting the pen tool, drawing around the child only where I need to, and then setting the mask mode from add to subtract. Okay, so anyone who's done anything like this in Photoshop, it should make perfect sense to you. What I'm doing is I'm applying a mask to the text to make it appear as if the child is on front, when in fact the text is always on front, but now I'm seeing the child because I've poked a kind of a hole through the text layer so that the child is visible in the right places. Now I've done it in a static sense. Now it's just a case of opening up those mask path parameters, zooming in, getting a little bit better detail. My selection tool, select only that vertex there. Now this can be fairly rough. What we'll do in a moment is we'll do it in a little bit more detail. Now I've put a keyframe there. Now I need to pull the playhead to where I need the mask to start. It's going to be roughly here. Go to the previous frame. There. Now what I can do is I can click and drag and move the mask and see if it still matches up. It kind of does. double click to either select it in its entirety or to get it broken up into its individual points. Now I don't actually need to worry too much about this here, so I'm wasting my time here because this isn't going to have any effect, but when I zoom in here and look at the intervening frames between there, still matching up for the most part. I know there isn't much of a T there to cover, but I'll just change the mask anyway. That's still looking okay. I can pull that in a little bit there. I might go back here, pull that in. Now to the point after where I put it down, I'll move that in there. Double click it to go into the individual points. Now what I should be doing is I should be going to this point, like I told you to do a moment ago, and moving that out there, and then dividing the space in half between to get it to match up. So you can see what the process here really is. You're dividing the space on the timeline in half, you're going back, you're adjusting individual vertices, getting that mask, doing it exactly what you want it to do on a point by or a frame by frame basis. I know watching this is like watching paint dry, but I'll be done in a second. Okay, that'll do. Now you could spend a little bit more time on it. Now the visual result will be that he'll walk across the text. The text is in the foreground, but because I've punched a hole in the text and used the movement of the figure so that the figure comes through the text, that's a rotoscope composite. Okay, and it's compositing a synthetic object into a scene. Now this is going to form the basis of a lot of what you're doing in your second assignment, because I'm going to be looking for you to be integrating typographic elements into a real world scene. Okay, so you're going to, for that to be really impressive, then things are going to have to move in front of it. Things are going to have to be behind it. It's going to have to look like it's really in that scene. Now that's it in its basic sense.